Welcome to Croud Academy Live. Today we'll be discussing how COVID-19 is shaping the financial services marketing. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Chris McIntyre. I'm Head of Client Strategy at Croud. Some of you will be familiar with us, but for those that aren't, I'll give you a very brief intro. Croud is a digital marketing agency. We're a bit different. We're powered by a combination of in-house talent as well as a network of digital specialists from all around the world. That allows us to deliver unrivaled scale and access to digital talent. We work with a range of financial services clients. A few examples are AXA, Hiscox, and PaySafe, a few of which I believe are on the call today. So for the webinar today, which is part of a series of webinars as part of Croud Academy Live, we've got two guest speakers. We've got Phil Jones from Microsoft Advertising, who's analytical lead for finance and insurance. He'll be taking us through some insights and trends that they're currently seeing in financial services marketing, and he's kindly put some slides together for today. And Martin Reed, who's Digital Account Director at Croud. He is our resident financial services expert, and he'll be answering questions following Phil's presentation. So just some housekeeping. The presentation will be roughly 20-25 minutes. We will then follow up with some Q&A afterwards. So you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom panel is a Q&A section. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please pop them in there, and I will then pose those to our speakers after the presentation. Okay, so I think without further ado, I will hand over to Phil.
Cool. Thanks very much for the intro there, Chris. And also thank you to Croud for inviting Microsoft to present some of the consumer behaviors that we're seeing on the finance and insurance vertical on Microsoft Advertising. As Chris kind of briefly touched on there, my role as an analytical lead is looking after finance and insurance, and essentially what that entails is looking at trends that we see on our marketplace, predominantly from a consumer behavioral standpoint, but then quantifying that in terms of what opportunities there may exist for marketers, particularly within the search advertising space. So just want to kind of signpost this presentation with a couple of key client resources that are available to everyone, regardless of whether you're a client of Microsoft or not. The first is a search trends ebook, which we published very recently, and that covers 4 key markets. And this relates not just to finance and insurance, but other key sectors where we've seen a large amount of change in the last few months. So that would include retail, consumer electronics, and automotive, but there's a whole host of consumer trends in there, and the link will be made available when we send these resources out after the call. The second resource is our Advertiser Resource Hub, and that's hosted on the Microsoft Advertising website. That essentially is then broken into 3 sections. So my role as an analytical lead is part of a global organization that we have. All analytical leads are working flat out really to ensure that we're understanding the most recent consumer trends and then being able to surface those to advertisers and clients. And it's a worthwhile resource to kind of bookmark as we sort of go into the weeks and months ahead, as that will be regularly updated with resources. So if we just kind of turn now into what's actually been happening and looking at sort of uncovering a bit more of the market, I'm going to talk to you a little bit around some of the behavioural shifts that we've seen, as this has been a year, even the last 6 months, a real sort of evolution in change of, you know, many different facets of people's lives, and being able to identify and understand how that's maybe manifested itself in terms of search behaviours. Secondly is around our hypothesis testing, and this is a lot more about some of our more agile and bite-sized approaches in terms of understanding either whether there's regulation changes or things that we're reading about in the news, actually testing and seeing how does that actually manifest itself, maybe in terms of search trends. And then lastly, I think looking to the future, everyone's very focused on what's actually going to be happening in the short and mid-term and maybe even longer term. And we've got some data points which I hope will be able to guide more of hopefully where we're seeing the markets going from a search advertising perspective. So if we look at some of the consumer behavioural shifts, this is looking at a UK view around device impression share, and we've broken this across PC, mobile and tablet. And I think the first thing to look at is on the left-hand side of the chart, you'll see that more than 6 out of 10 impressions at the start of the year were on the PC device. That typically is something that we do see predominantly on Microsoft advertising, as we have quite a strong Windows presence. So there's a number of people that are also sort of searching as they're at work. But really what's been interesting for me is that as we've sort of come closer to lockdown and even before lockdown, mobile actually overtook PC in terms of the number of or the amount of impression share that it actually had before lockdown. And really as we've sort of gone through the last 3 months in the lockdown period, we can see that PC and mobile have really kind of been jostling for position in terms of the device impression share. And my personal hypothesis on that really is around the fact that as people are maybe more comfortable working remotely, or if they've been furloughed, they might just be searching on their mobile a bit more at home in the evenings and also during the day as well. If we then layer that on top of, well, how does this actually look by device or click share? There's some quite kind of contrasting views that we see to the previous slide. And that is really that the majority of clicks from the start of the year, even through to now, are happening on the PC device. And that typically is something that we do see in finance and insurance, because it's a combination of either provider websites haven't quite got full mobile optimization, but also the actual point of purchase when people are predominantly, filling out forms or actually having to ensure that they are entering all the information very carefully. There's a preference there to actually complete or do the majority of that sort of final purchase on the PC device. So what we have though seen is that, as we've sort of started mid-February, the delta between these two lines was around 55 percentage points. But as we've really sort of come down into sort of the lockdown period, those two lines have actually narrowed at one stage to a 34 percentage point difference. So worthwhile just, I think, kind of considering that maybe how these behaviours have evolved, that may therefore manifest itself in terms of when looking at strategies and maybe allocating devices by, budgets by device. We are seeing some shifts in terms of the way that mobile is gaining momentum to the sort of slight detriment to PC. Turning a bit more now towards the lending category, this is something that for me was personally quite interesting, and that is when we look at the lending category, which encompasses both commercial and consumer lending. Looking at the composition index as a comparison between March 2019 and March 2020. And essentially what this view allows us to do is see if there's particular age ranges that have increased or decreased their likelihood to be searching in this particular category. So we can see for the UK, for instance, that there's been an increase in the number of 35 to 49-year-olds searching for lending products. But what's been personally of personal interest to me is that the 65 plus has actually really rocketed in terms of the composition index has increased massively there, not just for the UK but also for Europe. When we compare this then to the gender evolution, what we can see is that there's been a very slight increase in terms of the proportion of males searching in this category. But what I would say is, in the context of, you know, comparing both of these views, that is a very marginal increase. And actually the focus probably is slightly more on the composition index. And therefore that might mean that in terms of messaging or thinking about the types of people which in the lending category might be arriving at your website, that in itself presents an opportunity to evolve the messaging to reflect the different demographics which are now searching for these products. So if we move now into more of the hypothesis testing, the main hypothesis which has been sort of paramount throughout a number of questions that I've had in the last few years is around research and comparison, predominantly in the context of how is consumer confidence evolving, and is that manifesting itself in terms of people perhaps becoming more careful and calculated when they're doing that shopping? Are they doing more research and comparison and trying to get the best prices or the best products? And predominantly, you know, if you kind of think that if consumer confidence is falling, you might actually anticipate or expect that people will be making more of those research and comparisons to, you know, to try and ensure that they're getting the best value for money when they're making these purchases. So what we then decided to do is, if we look at all finance and insurance searches that have happened on the Microsoft network this year, we've then categorized them into two key categories. So first of all, looking at any of these queries which contain like compare or comparison related terms, which on this slide is denoted by the lighter line. And then the darker line is any terms which are containing the word the word best. So what we can see is at the start of the year, for the sort of almost first 12 weeks, there's a lot of compare and comparison searches more likely to have been happening, and that drove a lot of the volume in terms of what we saw within finance and insurance. But after the lockdown, both of these kind of decreased, but then we started to see this momentum picking up in terms of people looking for the best products. And I guess you could, in terms of thinking about this, both compare and best for me both indicate a focus on value for money. Comparison is maybe more price focused, but best in itself can be a way that people are thinking about ensuring that they're getting the best product. In insurance, that might be you know, around focusing on the fact that if people are feeling that they're more likely to claim on insurance, they want to ensure that they have the best policy behind them. But also maybe around like looking for mortgages or credit cards, people looking for the best mortgage rate or the best credit card. So that in itself can be that focus on value for money. And once again, I think that presents an opportunity to the mindset of consumers as they're moving throughout different purchase journeys, and therefore the role of messaging within that also plays a role. So if I turn this a bit more towards something maybe a bit more lighthearted in terms of looking at some of our furry friends in the form of dogs and cats, this was something that was actually quite surprising to me. A lot of news articles talking about the booming vertical of pandemic pets. I personally know a lot of people that have been looking at adopting dogs and cats, and you yourself may have gone through that that journey recently yourself. So really, I think what that presented was an opportunity to explore how does that actually look in terms of people looking for pet insurance. So when we've actually looked at this within the UK, we can see that looking at both searches and clicks, when we get to that point of lockdown on the 23rd of March, it took just 5 days before both searches and clicks rocketed. So searches increased 94% and clicks also went up by almost 3.5 times the average. And what we can really see is that this has been very much on an upward trajectory. That momentum has been continuing, and people are really focusing on ensuring, you know, that they're getting pet insurance as they're maybe adopting those. But I think in itself, it's also worthwhile expanding on this and thinking that maybe if people have bought pet insurance, whilst that might not be a product that you yourselves offer, that in itself is a lifestyle change that people are making, and therefore, does that allow more targeting options? Perhaps there's an opportunity with people looking to purchase cars because they need a bigger vehicle now if they've got dogs, or if they're looking for home insurance, that they need to then take into account home insurance which covers pets and accidents and those kind of things. So it's worthwhile maybe thinking about this kind of trend in the context of other products that you yourselves may sell, or even thinking about a cross-sell opportunity between pet insurance and other types of insurance that people might be interested in. So very much now looking on the looking forwards piece, this is the rebound analysis that I kind of talked about earlier, that we've really been sort of working on as an analytics organization within Microsoft Advertising. There's three, what I think scenarios that a number of governments and companies are going through at the moment in terms of thinking about the different scenarios that may exist in the short and mid or longer term. So that first of all is around normalization, and that could be the steady increase, different sectors recovering at different paces, but very much going back to what was the normal pre-COVID. The second aspect of this is looking at the second wave, and therefore, as lockdowns are eased throughout the world, if the R rate rises and that leads to more infections, is that then in itself going to lead to lockdowns, which might be on a local, national, or even an international level, and therefore that in itself will probably impact the behaviours that we see going forwards. And I think a lot of the trends that we've seen from the most recent lockdown probably can be applied in that particular scenario. And then lastly is maybe looking more towards a deep recession. So if the recovery is slower than expected, it's probably fair to say that consumer confidence is going to be eroded in quite a drastic sense. So we may see even more proliferation of some of the trends and the way that people have been searching and behaving in this current period of uncertainty may be magnified in the period ahead. So I'm just going to walk you a little bit through this this piece of analysis and how to interpret the data before we go into the slides. But essentially what this analysis technique we're using is it's called moving average convergence divergence, which in itself is a bit of a mouthful, but this is a statistical technique which is used primarily in investment trading. And essentially what investment traders are trying to do is stock prices are obviously fluctuating all day, every day, but they're trying to understand, is this short-term trend indicative of a longer-term trend? So they can either maximize their profit by holding on to shares as long as possible, or consider coming out of the market if things are on a downward trend. So if we look sort of more towards the bottom hand of the slides, there's three aspects of this. First of all, we've got this line of normality. So this is where we would expect the marketplace indexes to be based on previous 2 years worth of data. We would expect the index to be close to or at that line of normality. Secondly, we've got the blue lines, and these are a series of short-term moving averages. And then lastly is the red lines, which are longer-term moving averages. And essentially what we're doing is trying to understand the relationship between each of these three different data points to understand what that may indicate in terms of momentum. So in this example, if you see at point 2, the blue lines have crested the red lines, and that in itself indicates upward trajectory, because that shorter term trend is going to be bringing up the long-term moving averages. And if you look at point 3, you can see that some way before this, the blue lines were on the downward momentum, and that's now started to bring down the long-term moving averages. So you can hopefully get an idea from this as to how this kind of model looks. But what we've then done is look at this for the UK across different types of insurance. And I've tried to kind of signpost this here with the different colours at the end of each one to kind of denote what kind of stage of recovery or health that particular market or sector is at. So if we look at pet insurance, what immediately kind of stands out to me is that, you know, both of these blue and red lines are quite a long way from that line of normality. So that in itself indicates that the market is quite buoyant, but anyone that's maybe considering pet insurance strategies at the moment, we might be going more back towards a line of normality as lockdowns are easing. Maybe pet insurance or pets aren't as much of a focus, or people may have, you know, purchased their pet insurance already, and therefore they're not really at the point of renewal. When we look at car insurance, we can kind of see, you know, again, this is beyond the line of normality, but we're very much at a touch and go kind of point in terms of this marketplace momentum. Home insurance is at the moment green, and we're paying very close attention to how that might be materializing going forwards. Travel insurance, as you can kind of see, and probably not to really be too much of a surprise in that, you know, we're quite a long way off that point of normality. But I think what's been encouraging is that marketplace signals, we're not at the red point at the moment. It's gone back to yellow. And a lot of that might be around the optimism of people hoping that they're going to get some kind of foreign holiday, maybe in the not too distant future. Life insurance, as you can kind of see, is on a similar trend to some of these other points here. But if we move forward now, looking at investments and lending, we can see that investments, it's again higher than this point of normality, but potentially going to be on a downward sort of trajectory. And you know, as we're kind of thinking more of the stabilization within the stock market, that in itself is particularly around the investment sector, maybe causing or contributing to some of the declining momentum that we're seeing there. And then credit cards and mortgages. So I think both of these are probably going to be hopefully restoring in some sense if consumer confidence starts to recover. Some of the data from the Bank of England does actually point or make reference to car payment data showing a point of recovery now. So hopefully that will you know, start to continue to recover and we'll go back towards the points of normality in the not too distant future. And then I think just taking more of a global perspective, layering the same view on across a number of different markets, which does include the UK and also the US. The first thing that kind of stands out to me is that 2/3 of these markets are actually at yellow at the moment. So, you know, there is that maybe caution around the recovery in these particular markets from a search advertising perspective. But when we also look at, you know, there is positive signs in France, Italy, and Singapore. So, you know, hopefully some of these other markets will be able to follow in their lead in the coming weeks and months ahead. So just, I think in terms of wrapping this up, there's three main things that are very top of mind for me and hopefully for yourselves. And that is, first of all, that we've seen this increased focus on value for money. So we're seeing the sharper focus on people looking for the best product, and therefore that manifests maybe in terms of the opportunity to reflect that in terms of messaging approaches. Secondly is the rise of mobile. So particularly around lockdowns, we've seen PC and mobile intersecting, and therefore it might be worth you know, revisiting how do budget allocations work within that particular insight, particularly if we, you know, if we go towards more points of lockdowns, that in itself may continue to be a trend that we see moving forwards. And then lastly is looking at the rebound. So within the UK, we are seeing that insurance, the signals generally are remaining high, but there is that diversified focus. And countries in itself are at various stages of recovery. So, you know, there's perhaps lessons from other markets, but also I think anyone that's maybe more internationally focused, it's worthwhile kind of considering those markets that are, you know, on that upward momentum to considering that for future decisions and strategy moving forwards. And that is it, really. I mean, I'm going to pass you back to Chris for any questions that we've had, and I'm happy to take those.
Great, thanks a lot, Phil. That's certainly some very interesting insights. So I think we'll start the Q&A session. So we've had a few questions come through, and some questions were sent through beforehand as well that I think we can dive into. So let's start with a topic that actually you've just touched upon quite heavily in your presentation around seasonality. It's certainly a question that we've had from multiple advertisers on. We've had this imposed strange few months in our lives, and what does that mean for the seasonality that we live and die by in financial services especially. So I think I'll probably pose this one to Martin to give you a rest, Phil. But yeah, just in terms of seasonality, how do we think it'll be impacted for the rest of the year, Martin?
I think it's going to vary based on the industry that you're in. So if you look at the car insurance metrics and that prior graph on the increase, and whether that's been impacted by the fact that dealerships were opened a couple of weeks ago. So I think that as more announcements within the UK, especially as those things open up, you'll see little spikes and bumps coming up. I think the important thing to think about is that when that changes, it will be a lot of advertisers going for that volume at the same time, much like it is around Black Friday and around the holiday season. So I think that you will see very likely a large spike in CPCs. You're going to see more aggression. So I think that there's a couple of things there in terms of reviewing your targeting and making sure that your budgets are, you're carefully assigning them in the right way so that you don't get hit by a sudden spike and you spend a lot of money on an audience that might not work. But also reviewing your optimizations as well. If you're using automated bidding or, whether that will impact your CPA targeting, your ROI targeting. I think throughout this whole process, we've seen clients shift the levers of what is important over time. So staying close to the business as usual stuff that isn't, necessarily the really cool stuff is actually really important, and staying very close to the detail.
Yeah. Okay. So, and what advice would you give in terms of, just staying on that topic, in terms of budgeting? So, what sort of approach would you take? And would you just look at completely sort of resetting goals? Obviously you would keep metrics the same, but in terms of short-term versus long-term goals, if you have any advice there for marketers as we go into sort of the usual peak in sort of September or October.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it is going to depend on your business capacity, right? So if something shifts like car dealerships, all of a sudden there is a pent-up level of demand that was dammed in and wasn't, there was no volume there, and then all of a sudden it will hit the market all at once. So I suppose make it, from an insurance point of view especially, making sure that the call center is ready for those sorts of things, the amount of volume that might come in. So having those conversations with other parts of the business, understanding what their capacity is, will then start to impact what you might want to bid on and what you might not want to. I think most businesses will be of the opinion that we want as much as we can get as soon as we can get it, and we've got ground to make up. But fundamentally, we've seen with retailers over the last 3 months, how this has impacted their ability to deliver, not having enough people in the warehouse because of social distancing, and what that has done. We've seen Next shut their website off a few times. I think we've seen insurers scramble to that as people have worked from home. So involving other parts of the business in that discussion and understanding what the appetite really is and what the capacity is will then give you an idea of, all right, well, search volume from what it was in February trebles, what might that look like in terms of impact? And I think the other thing we look at in these situations with clients often is like a traffic light system of what's the bare minimum we'd want to go down. Do we just want to drop down to brand? Do we want to turn off entirely and see what happens? And then what's the next stage that we would switch on? So, the terms, longer tail terms arguably, or the high vis terms that we know we need to compete on, especially in finance, and just having sort of a contingency plan of, if everything goes well, then it'll look like this. But If it doesn't, then we'll probably just have these things on, and you're never going to get it right because, you know, nobody really knows what's going to happen. But just having some plans means that you can react a lot faster, and that you're not spending time doing forecasting when the news is announced of, you know, you can now, you know, pubs have opened, for example.
Yeah. Okay. I'm keen to explore the topic of search interest. Obviously, there is, you know, as marketers, we keep really close tabs on what search volumes are and sort of changes. Obviously, Phil talked through a few, you know, around those, you know, best financial products and best searches, how they've seen more of an uptick in those. I guess I'll pose this one to Phil. What sort of advice would you have for marketers, you know, how to approach these changing search trends, either in terms of different ways of searching, or device. So if we're seeing, you know, more mobile at the moment, what sort of advice would you have?
So I think for me, the main thing really is around the actual messaging standpoint. If we're seeing like an evolution of how people are searching or what's important to them when they may be in these purchase journeys, I think that in itself, you know, presents like a great opportunity to look at things like ad copies or maybe landing pages, really trying to give people the information that they need when they sort of landing on the websites, to hopefully inform them as to, you know, pushing them more down that purchase funnel or consideration funnel. So I think that for me is like the main one really. And then I think it's also about maybe considering getting creative really around, you know, are there trends that we're seeing in other areas that therefore might actually impact a vertical that's, or a product that's important for, you know, ourselves as a business. So, you know, to the example I kind of had with pet insurance, if you know, lending to people that are maybe looking at purchasing cars or, you know, car insurance, those kind of things, it might be worth, those might be the people that are now actually looking at buying or changing vehicles, whereas previously, you know, or if you look at it at a holistic view, you might think that actually that market sort of view might be limited. So there's probably pockets of opportunity, I think, within each of these different kind of sectors.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a real need for marketers to really give more thought than usual to messaging and targeting at the moment. And that kind of leads on to another question we got around consumer trust. So I think there'll probably be a real temptation for advertisers at the moment to, you know, really deep dive into the data and the changes we're seeing in terms of user behavior and potentially over target. But obviously we need to be cognizant of the fact that might be seen as opportunistic and people searching for more personal finance than usual, for example. One of the questions came in, I'll probably pose this to Martin, that was how will COVID-19 impact the ability for financial services to build consumer trust? Do you think it'll have any impact on consumer trust at all, and what sort of do we need to be aware of?
I think there'll be a lot of brands that will be arguably will damage their trust in terms of how they've reacted to this. From a personal standpoint, of booking holidays 6 months ago and trying to get that money back is difficult, and that, you know, that means that you then might not consider some businesses again. And even though, you know, from my point of view, you can understand why they might not be able to do that, being clear on that message of what is going on. I think that regular communication with customers is going to be important, and being open and honest about what is possible. I think it's separate to this, that the whole consumer trust piece is almost linked to privacy, and, you know, the changes that we've seen in GDPR, the news that we're seeing around, you know, arguably cookies going away and trying to move away from identifying and fingerprinting people and moving to a better model is only going to get bigger and better. You know, it's going to become more important. So I think if you can build that trust element into the messaging, it's something that works. If you look at a lot of the broader, you know, the big TV spend that's come out recently, it's not very polished TV ads, it's done on camera phones, and it's done well, but it is emotive and it's not necessarily about the brand. That sort of "we're here for you" sort of message. And I think if you're genuinely backing that and you're not just saying it, then you'll make some wins, certainly.
With sort of marketing budgets being stretched, but more of a need for sort of short-term returns with some businesses struggling. Are there any tips you'd give to marketers, sort of how to prove the value of digital? Any sort of tools or techniques to recommend over the next few months?
Such an interesting question, because I think the main thing is being able to showing that return on investment is really going to be probably critical for a number of businesses. You've obviously kind of got maybe some of the more established businesses might actually use this as an opportunity to increase their market share. So I think maybe for everyone really, it's going to be around looking at the return on the investment, and being able to capitalize on kind of remarketing and those kind of things to really guide people through the journey to maximize hopefully that return on investment. And I think the other point is also paying very close attention to what competitors do, because as we do know, this particularly finance and I guess even more especially insurance is a very competitive space. So there are probably areas in terms of learning from competitors, but also I think, as you kind of touched on, around looking outside the box in terms of, I think, being able to tell those stories and how it's maybe a more thematic approach to marketing or digital marketing that's really kind of needed at the moment. I think sort of an insight-led approach is normally what I would be leaned to in terms of probably more my background, but very much taking, this is what we're seeing from consumer trends, and then layering on the aspects of that are important to businesses, ROI, market share, those kind of things, and being able to show it within that kind of lens.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm keen to explore this a bit more with Martin in terms of attribution. I know you've helped a number of our advertisers with syncing offline and online data. Is there any advice you have for advertisers on this over the next few months?
Generally, when you're starting to talk about things that sit outside campaign budgets and keywords and ads, and you're starting to talk about integrating other parts of the business or something, being a project that might need investment, it's really important to get buy-in from whoever it is that you need buy-in from, be that the CMO, the CTO, the board, and being able to paint a very clear picture of what you want to do, why it's important, and more specifically what the impact is. Try not to talk in digital terms. Talk about the fact that this is where the industry is moving. Look for case studies online of competitors who may have done it, even if they're people in other industries that maybe face similar business challenges to you, to build that case of this is something that we should be looking to do. Get them excited about it, get them bought in. That's the first challenge. And then the second is actually starting small and building momentum. So find the small tests that you can do first, because most boards in their right mind, especially at the minute, are not going to sign off £1 million budgets on a proposal that the digital team has come up with without solid backing. So, if you want to look at the impacts of online and offline, it's not necessarily the cleanest way of doing it, but maybe pick a handful of stores and upweight the bidding around that area, upweight the activity, get feedback from the store managers about whether there is more footfall. There are technical ways of doing it, and there are easy ways, and there are much more complex, difficult ways and providers out there that support it. But I think just trying to find a way to get the first foot forward, and it doesn't have to be perfect. I think whenever you're talking about attribution and changing a business, the theme of the conversation needs to be, it's better than what we're doing yesterday. And if you can keep that going and keep that momentum going, then that's where you look back 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and all of a sudden you've made an awful lot of progress.
Really good advice, and that's absolutely what all the best advertisers have been doing over the last year or two anyway. It's just
easier said than done.
Yeah, and it's become more important in recent times, and more pressure on budgets. Thanks everyone on the webinar for joining, and thanks to our speakers Phil and Martin. We hope you've all found this useful and insightful. We'll be sending out the slides presented today, as well as a recording of the webinar.
Thanks all.
Thank you.